But Thomas, who was called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands, and put my finger in the mark of the nails, and my hand in his side, I will not believe." So we've never been together on this Sunday. I've had 3 Easters here at St. Luke's and now a 4th. But for the first 3, we had Easter together and we never had Easter 2 together. In fact, I have always, since I came to St. Luke's, taken this Sunday off. And some might think that it's because I didn't want to preach Doubting Thomas, but some it's just that you're just exhausted, and it's an okay Sunday to take off. I will say though, 2 years ago on this Sunday, I was actually preaching at another church in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, at the baptism of a friend's child. And I got to preach this great passage. But you and I, have never spent this Sunday together. The story of Thomas that we get today seems like the very natural next thing after a big good happening to a person. You know, they talk about this thing called buyer's remorse, that you work yourself up to get that new automobile. Maybe it's the first house that you bought. And right after the glow of having that great purchase done wears off, you actually are often quite down in the dumps, imagining that you have made a terrible mistake, that you've gotten in over your head, or this was not the right house to invest in, or this wasn't the right person to commit to a relationship with. That's all very natural. And at first blush, it seems to me that that is actually what is happening with Thomas here. Even though his friends have seen the Lord and he has not, you wonder if Thomas is getting a little bit of buyer's remorse. Or, as we often think, and we often call him, Doubting Thomas. That it's not just a buyer's remorse situation for him, it's even deeper. It goes to doubt. Well, I'm not sure either of those things capture it, though I think there probably are kernels in the complex emotion that Thomas is having in this story. The first thing, though, I'd like to invite you to do is to remember the other things that Thomas has done in John's Gospel. Because Thomas is quite an important figure in John's Gospel. In fact, of all the disciples, 12 of them, we only ever get to hear in all 4 Gospels, maybe 4 or 5 of them say any words at all. In fact, once you get down to 10, 11, and 12, sometimes the Gospel writers themselves can't even remember their names. And it gets a little garbled when they make lists of the disciples. But Thomas, he plays a role in 2 very important stories, ones that we have heard recently. On the Sunday before Palm Sunday, we heard the story of Lazarus rising from the dead. And in that story, we need to be reminded that it is Thomas that when Jesus says, "We're going to go to Bethany, because my friend Lazarus is asleep, he's dead," the other disciples object and say, "Lord, if you go there, you know that the leaders there will be waiting for you to arrest you." And Thomas says, "If you're going there to die, Jesus, we will go there and die with you." Quite a statement of faith. Quite the opposite of Peter, who we give lots of love to. And we think about Peter as being the great father of the church. Peter, in the same situation that occurs in Matthew, where Jesus says we're going somewhere and everybody says you're going to go there and die, Peter says, no, you are not. And Jesus tells him to get behind him, Satan. Thomas, in his story, where Jesus is presented with taking a trip that will almost certainly end in his arrest, says, let us go. And whatever fate you're going to have, Jesus, let us have it too. And then the story of Thomas on Maundy Thursday, where Thomas shows up and he's sitting there at the table with all of them, and Jesus finally comes to kind of this moment of comfort around the table after he has washed their feet, and he tells them, in my Father's house there are many mansions, and if I go there to prepare a place for you, where I am, you will be also. And it's only Thomas who pushes Jesus on this and tells Jesus, you know, Jesus, we don't know where you're going, and we don't know the way to get there. And Jesus has this great line to Thomas saying, essentially, you do, because you know me, and I'm the way, the truth, and the life. Thomas sets up Jesus to make this grand reveal to his friends that they know much more than they know. So Thomas should not be characterized by this Sunday where we remember every single year as though Thomas's feast day is around his one moment of doubt. We should remember that he was committed to Jesus in a way that was willing to give his life. And he was very concerned when he thought Jesus was going somewhere he did not know how to get to. Thomas is not a cynic. Thomas is not a skeptic. Thomas is not a doubter. But in this one instance, he wanted something more than he'd had to believe that Jesus was raised from the dead. And what I find, I think, is more accurate of Thomas in this moment is that Thomas wanted to have the same experience his friends had already had. So the story goes, and I didn't read it all here, but if you listened to the liturgy this morning, you heard the whole story. Jesus had already shown up to the other 10 disciples. He'd already appeared to them, and he said, peace be with you, and he told them to forgive folks. And Thomas just didn't happen to be there. Thomas wanted to have the same experience as his friends. They got to meet Jesus, and Thomas, who was committed to Jesus, was feeling, I think, probably more than doubt, he was feeling left out. Now, it should be pointed, if we do want to go the doubt route with Thomas, we need to go there with the disciples too, because the disciples had also been told that Jesus was raised from the dead, and they had told the woman who told them that they did not believe her. Thomas is not doing anything if he is doubting that his other 10 compadres had not already done. In fact, you can see in their answer that they are more dismissive when they are told by the women that Jesus has been raised from the dead than Thomas is. Thomas doesn't necessarily dismiss it. Thomas just says, I want to see him myself. Probably because he missed them. And I think that's a feeling that we all can identify with Thomas in. We might not be able to identify in his courage to go with Jesus and die with him when he'd be arrested if he goes to Bethany. We might not even identify with him sitting at the table being confused by our friend who is telling us he's going away, though we don't know that he has any plans to make a trip. But we certainly can feel left out We can certainly feel as though other folks have had an experience with Jesus that we wish we could have. And we could want that. Jesus does show up eventually to Thomas. And Thomas gets to say the words that nobody else gets to say in John's Gospel. He gets to make the profession of faith that Jesus is my Lord and my God. Thomas gets it, and then Jesus wants to remind him of something, which is, you were able to have the experience that you have with me, Thomas, but there are going to be other people that have a different experience of me, and they'll believe too. And we each need to keep that in mind. That the faith that we have, though it is founded on a common person, Jesus the Christ, it does not all manifest in the same way. And when we have the experience or the realization that other folks have had a different experience of Jesus, or we have the longing in ourselves to have the same experience as somebody else, we need to just kind of let it roll off, let it go. We need to accept Jesus as he's come to us, and recognize that Jesus will come to others too, in other new and exciting ways. We need to include them in what we call our brothers and sisters, but we also need not to exclude ourselves when we feel as though we have not had as meaningful an experience with Jesus as someone else. It's so hard, especially in this time of pandemic. I mean, one of the things that we see across the news is that everybody has a different experience of what it's like to be isolated. Some thrive, some are going crazy, being locked up in their homes. You know, psychologists tell us that there will be many, many divorces after this experience. And doctors tell us there'll be many, many babies born after this experience. But it does not mean that we are not having a common experience, one of living in a time of great risk and danger. We are all different, and we all need to recognize, even in our differences, we might have the same experience of risk. We're just handling it in much, much different ways. The same goes for our faith. We all have a much different faith from one another. It's really impossible for me to tell you how to be exactly. And it's really impossible for you to know how I got to have the faith that I have. But we do have something in common. And that is this person of Jesus. And no matter how he has appeared to us, he has. And we believe. Thomas is the encouragement to all those who feel left out. Thomas is the encouragement to all those who want and desire more. And Thomas, finally, should be the encouragement to all of us to be able, in the midst of whatever way Jesus has come to us, to proclaim, my Lord and